November 2003. Thick fog blanketed Rockport Harbor, Maine, where cold winds from Penobscot Bay whipped across the water as if to erase every trace of time. The beam from Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell's flashlight sliced through the darkness, illuminating the damp ground beside an abandoned lumber shed. "Central, I need the forensics unit at the South Harbor immediately. We may have found human remains." Her voice echoed over the radio, gradually swallowed by the sound of waves and mist. What had started as a routine check in the old records digitization program had now become a horrific discovery. As the forensics team carefully sifted through layers of soil, they spotted the top of a brown leather bag, embossed with AP emerging from the mud, next to a broken stethoscope and a faded piece of nurse's fabric. Just minutes later, the first human bones surfaced under the flashlight beam. Everyone stood still, and in that moment, over half a century of silence in the town of Camden was torn open. For 54 years, the disappearance of Nurse Alexine Penrose had been an unsolved haunting, a young, devoted woman who vanished from the health center on a winter night in 1949, leaving behind an empty room, a cold cup of coffee, and an unfinished duty log. No body, no blood, no clues. The whole town had mobilized to search the harbor. The river, the pine forests along the roads were all turned upside down, but every effort came back empty-handed. The file closed with the cold notation, "Missing, presumed drowned." Generations grew up with that story, treating it as part of the collective memory, until old evidence in the Knox County archives unexpectedly spoke up. A brass button, engraved with MC, a red-waxed medicine pouch, and forgotten fingerprints had opened the door back to that fateful night. For the first time in over half a century, forensic science entered a story that human memory had faded from. Modern DNA analysis revealed traces of a single man, the one Camden had trusted absolutely. A man who had healed them, delivered their babies, attended Alexine's memorials for years, and smiled kindly when saying, "She must have gone somewhere to start a new life." But the truth, like the cold earth beneath their feet today, never disappears. It only waits for the right moment to surface. The discovery at Rockport Harbor was not just the end of a disappearance. It was the first link in a chain of events that would upend the secrets the Camden community had tried to bury for over half a century. Because when authorities first identified the suspect and prepared for the arrest warrant, they knew that person was no stranger, no shadow lurker, but someone who had lived among them for 54 years, the one they had trusted, the one they called the town doctor. The Penrose case was not just a decoded mystery, it was a testament to the power of persistence, of people who wouldn't let files gather dust, and of science, which had given the final voice to victims silenced too long. It was also a story of a small community divided, of deception disguised as trust, and of justice, which can be delayed, but never denied. Before continuing this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and share this video. Camden, Maine, December 1949. Winds from Penobscot Bay stung through the narrow streets, carrying dampness and thick fog that enveloped the entire town. Oil lamps in the windows of wooden houses cast a feeble light, flickering in the gray mist. At the end of the main road, the community health center was still lit, even though it was nearly 10 o'clock at night. Inside, 32-year-old Nurse Alexine Penrose was finishing the last entries in the duty log. She tidied the medicine cabinet, folded her white coat neatly, then put on her sweater, and told her colleague on shift that she was just going to meet someone for a few minutes and would be right back. That was the last thing anyone heard her say. As the wooden door closed, her shadow faded into the thick fog outside. A few minutes later, a neighbor living across from the health center saw a gray Jeep parked in front. The headlights pierced the fog, then went out. Two figures stood talking briefly, then there was only silence. No engine departing, no footsteps, just the absolute stillness of a Maine winter night. The next morning, the first patient knocked on the health center door at 7:30 and got no answer. The door was ajar, the desk lamp still on, the coffee cup on the table stone cold. The duty log stopped mid-page. Alexine's white coat still hung on the rack, but her purse and wristwatch were gone. When her colleague arrived, they searched the entire room and found no trace. No signs of a struggle, no disturbed items, just an eerie chill, as if someone had left in a hurry and never returned. All day, no one saw her anywhere. By noon, her mother, Mrs. Penrose, drove from Rockport, stepping into the empty room where her daughter had worked the night shift. She called her name several times, with no response. The coffee ring still marked the table. The chair not pushed in, the wall clock frozen at 10:47. She looked around for a long while, then turned to the on-duty officer, her voice trembling but firm. "My daughter would never abandon her shift. Something happened. Please, find her for me." Mrs. Penrose's words echoed in the empty duty room, making the air even thicker. Sheriff William Doyle arrived at the health center less than an hour later. He stepped in, removed his hat, and silently surveyed the lit room. Everything intact, as if the young woman had just stepped out to fetch more hot water. The coffee cup on the table was cold. The duty log open and unfinished, the white coat hanging neatly. Doyle gently pulled out the chair, sat down, and placed his hand on the paper, still scented with antiseptic. He had seen dozens of disappearances, but his gut told him this one was not simple. That afternoon, he mobilized the entire Camden police force, along with a few local fishermen familiar with the waters. Two teams were divided. One combed around the health center and residential area. The other followed the dirt road leading to the Megantuquoik River. The afternoon sky was thick gray, fog rolling down from the hills, the smell of sea salt seeping into the damp cold air. Old flashlights swept the ground, reflecting fresh mud tracks. Doyle knelt down, using a wooden ruler to measure each footprint, a series of small women's shoe prints, smooth soles, extending to the water's edge and stopping. A few meters away, he spotted deep Jeep tire tracks in the mud, clear military tread patterns. He froze, marking them with pencil, and noting in his log. Footprints matched Nurse Penrose's size. Jeep tire tracks, verify owner. As officers continued combing around the center, there were no signs of a struggle or disturbed objects. No blood, no drag marks, nothing but absolute silence. Doyle had someone use a Polaroid camera to photograph the scene, then joined the team down to the riverbank. The Megantuquoik water was black and thick, reflecting flashlight beams like trembling streaks of light. An officer bent down with the light and reported, "Nothing but floating debris, sir." Doyle stared at the icy, slow-flowing water, wind whistling through the wooden bridge, unease rising from his stomach. As night fell, the search shifted to the Camden docks, where the river emptied into the bay. Fishermen helped with small boats, using iron hooks to drag lightly along the water's edge. Curious townsfolk gathered on the shore, some saying they saw car lights around 11 p.m., others claiming they heard an engine start and then cut off. No one got a clear look in the fog. Doyle noted it all, missing no detail. Near midnight, a young officer spotted a white cloth glove snagged on a reed branch by the water. Doyle carefully picked it up, shook off the mud, and recognized it as the type nurses still used on duty. The glove was damp, fingertips soiled with dirt. He bagged it as evidence, numbered #1, and instructed it be taken to storage. The team fell silent as he spoke. No one falls into the river and leaves footprints right at the edge like this. Someone else was here. The next morning, the search expanded. They mapped a 2-mile radius around the health center, dividing areas among teams. The fire department's dive team was called in to scour deep water near the docks. No body was found, but a fisherman reported seeing Jeep tire tracks heading to the harbor the night before, then vanishing. Doyle personally checked, noting the tracks matched the tread of a military Willys Jeep, the same type Dr. Matthew Carver from the health center drove daily. He paused, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes, but stayed silent. That afternoon, the search team waded through mud at the wooden bridge edge. An officer signaled, and Doyle approached in the soaked reeds. They found a small brown leather medicine pouch embossed with faint AP on the flap. Inside were several sedative vials, prescription labels bearing Dr. Matthew Carver's name. Doyle frowned, closed the pouch, and ordered it for testing. No one said another word, only the soft splashes of footsteps in the mud amid the fog. As the second night fell, winds from the bay blew harder, the black water rippling. Doyle stood on the bank, holding the evidence pouch, a chill creeping up his neck. He knew this was beyond what people called a disappearance. No struggle, no blood, just a line of footprints stopping in the mud, and jeep tracks leaving in the cold night. Before leaving the scene, he wrote the final line in his log: initial hypothesis, accident or taken away. The fog continued to blanket the water, and in that silence, no one knew that those small traces were the beginning of an investigation spanning over half a century. The next morning, as the first faint sunlight pierced the thick fog of Camden, Sheriff William Doyle sat in his small office. A cold cup of coffee before him, and a thick stack of reports from the previous night's search. On the desk, the brown leather AP evidence pouch was carefully sealed. Inside were sedative vials, bearing Dr. Matthew Carver's prescription signature. Doyle stared at the neat handwriting on the labels, his suspicion sharpening. A missing nurse, her monogrammed pouch under the river, labeled by the doctor who worked with her the night she vanished. By mid-morning, a report from the on-scene investigators arrived. A witness at Camp Harbor Tavern, less than 2 miles from the health center, said that on the night of December 15th, he saw Alexine Penrose arrive with Dr. Carver. Doyle drove there immediately. The tavern sat right by the harbor, the smell of cigarette smoke and burning wood mingling with the damp air. The owner, a middle-aged man named Frank Delaney, recounted that around 9:30 p.m. that night, Alex came in with a few friends, then Dr. Carver appeared. She looked worried, Frank said, wiping a glass. Carver sat next to her, talked softly. They left together, probably around 10:15. I remember because the tavern clock chimed just then. Doyle had him write a formal statement, emphasizing the departure time. Back at headquarters, Doyle summoned Dr. Matthew Carver for questioning. Carver, 35, tall, with a stern face, arrived in a thick gray coat. He entered confidently, but his eyes were slightly sunken, as if from lack of sleep. Doyle opened the log, voice even. Dr. Carver, do you know why we've asked you here? Carver nodded. It's about Alexine. I'm worried too. She was a good person. Doyle leaned in. Witnesses saw you two at Camp Harbor the night she disappeared. Confirm? Carver hesitated a beat, then nodded. Yes, I went there because she called me. She said she was scared of her boyfriend, Shane Anderson. They'd been arguing for days. I just wanted to help. Doyle noted every word. When asked about leaving the tavern, Carver replied firmly. Around 9:45, I dropped her back at the health center. She said she needed to be alone. I left before 10. The statement sounded reasonable, but it didn't match the witness report. According to Frank Delaney, they left after 10:15, and the neighbor near the health center insisted seeing the Jeep lights go out around 10:30. Doyle looked at Carver and asked, "Where did you go after?" Carver replied, "Home. I have a wife and 2 kids, Sheriff Doyle. I don't get involved in trouble." Doyle said nothing, just noted at the page's end. Verify Carver alibi. That afternoon, police summoned Shane Anderson, 28, a Rockport Harbor fisherman mentioned in Carver's statement. Shane arrived in a salt-scented thick coat, hands call used. Seated before the desk, he fidgeted, voice hoarse. "You think I did something to her? I love Alex. We argued, sure, but I never laid a hand on her." Doyle asked, "Do you know where she was that night?" Shane nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. "She said she'd meet Carver. I told her not to go, but she said it was just a quick talk. She never came back." Doyle pressed for time. "Around what hour?" "Must have been near 9:30. I saw her leave the tavern with him. I stayed a few more minutes, then went home." Doyle followed up. "Anyone corroborate?" The bartender. I was right at the counter. They all saw. Comparing the statements, Doyle spotted the timeline mismatch. Carver said they left at 9:45. Shane said after 9:30. But witnesses confirmed 10:15. Both placed themselves outside the last window when Alex was alive. The sheriff reviewed the log and scene map, realizing if Carver left at 9:45 and went straight home, he couldn't have left jeep tracks near the river at 10:30, unless he'd returned to the health center area. That evening, Doyle checked Carver's schedule. The center's secretary confirmed no patients after 9 p.m. Health center phone logs showed an intra-county call at 9:28, lasting 32 seconds, recipient unknown. Doyle stared at the number, a hunch rising. He called Carver's home directly, asking his wife, "December 15th night, when did your husband get home?" Mrs. Carver hesitated. "I went to bed early, probably around midnight." The next morning, Doyle wrote the summary report. Witness confirms Alex left tavern with Carver at 10:15. Carver claims 9:45, home before 10 o'clock. Shane denies violence, corroborates Carver as last with her. Jeep tire tracks appear near health center 10:30. The final line in the report, in firm script. From all statements available, Dr. Matthew Carver was the last to see Alexine Penrose alive. Doyle set down his pen, gazing out the fogged window. Across the street, the small health center loomed hazy in the morning mist, as if the place itself awaited his return to reveal what had truly happened. The next morning, as fog still clung thick around Camden's hills, Sheriff William Doyle returned to the health center. He wanted to see the scene with his own eyes, not through photos or statements. The room was as silent as the first day, gray light from the fogged window falling on the table, where the cold coffee cup still sat in place. Doyle donned gloves, approaching the glass-paneled doorframe by the desk, where Alexine often stood smoking on breaks. Wiping the thick condensation, he noticed a faint palm print, as if someone had pressed hard against the glass. Under the light, blurred rubber glove ridges emerged. This wasn't hospital issue. These were specialized medical gloves, used in procedures, issued only to the health center's doctor. Doyle called a technician to photograph it, noting position and direction. Out back, the forensics team collected mud and tire impressions around the center. One young officer, Miller, spotted fresh tire tracks right behind the building, heading toward the dirt road to the docks. Deep treads, even herringbone pattern, hallmark of wartime Willys Jeeps. Doyle knelt, measuring groove spacing with a ruler. The measurements matched the evidence log's tire pattern sample exactly. He said nothing, just stared silently down the fog-shrouded road toward where divers had found Alexine's pouch the night before. Immediately after, Doyle ordered Dr. Carver's Jeep brought to the police yard for comparison. Once snow was brushed from the tires, the herringbone grooves stood out clearly. The technician laid a paper impression over them, rubbed fine charcoal, and compared lines. The marks matched to the millimeter. Carver stood nearby, silent, hands in his coat pockets. Doyle asked directly, "December 15th night, did you use the vehicle?" Carver replied calmly, "I only went to the center, then home, never to the docks." Doyle met his eyes, voice cold. "Then why are your tire tracks there?" Carver shrugged, gaze steady. "Maybe someone borrowed it. I leave it in the yard, keys in the ignition." Doyle didn't respond, just signaled the technician to continue. Back in the duty room, forensics kept scanning. Under the wooden floor by the desk, they found a faint half-meter skid mark, like a dragged shoe. Surrounding wood dust was fresh, indicating the skid was recent. At the table leg's base, a small splintered molding edge with a reddish-brown streak, dark like dried coffee. But Doyle knew better than anyone it wasn't coffee. He said nothing. Just leaned down, lightly touching the splinter with his pencil tip, then nodded to Miller. "Sample it." As faint sunlight filtered through the doorframe, fine dust motes sparkled in the air. Doyle paced slowly around the room, reconstructing positions, Alexine at the desk, door ajar, the other person entering. A word, a sudden move, perhaps a shove. The floor skid under the table, the splintered molding, the glove print on the glass, all pointed one way. There had been a confrontation in this room. That afternoon, Doyle invited Carver back to the health center for work. He wanted to observe the man's reaction returning to where Alexine vanished. Carver seemed overly calm, saying upon entry, "I told you, she just needed rest. I left before 10. Doyle didn't react, just gestured for him to sit by the window. As Carver placed his hands on the table, light hit the glass with the glove print. Doyle spoke slowly. "You said you didn't leave the room, right?" Carver nodded. Doyle pointed to the pane. "Then why is there a man's rubber glove print here, same type you wear in the clinic?" Carver followed his gaze, pausing briefly, then kept his voice even. "I work here all week, must be from before." Doyle didn't reply, just turned to the door. "Bring in the tire match print." When the tire impression was laid on the table beside the dock track photo, every detail aligned perfectly. Carver maintained composure, but sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the room's chill. Doyle looked at him, voice low but firm. "That night, your vehicle was at the docks. This room has your glove-type prints. Floor has a skid. Table has impact marks. You still claim you didn't leave?" Carver was silent a long moment, then murmured, "I don't remember clearly. Maybe I stepped out a minute to check the lock." Doyle gathered the files, closed the log, asked no more. He knew, in investigations, a suspect's silence often said more than any words. As he stepped out of the center, Doyle paused at the heavy wooden door. In his mind, the pieces began fitting. Tire tracks, glove print, floor skid, splinter, all not from a peaceful disappearance. It was a rushed sequence of actions, concealment, and perhaps fear. Fog rolled in again, obscuring the road to the river. In the dim light, Doyle managed one thought. Someone had been with Alexine that night, and not to help her. The next morning, thick fog blanketed Camden's docks, the water gray and murky as a clouded mirror. Sheriff William Doyle stood on the old wooden bridge, briefcase of files in hand, eyes following the dive team preparing to enter the water. From the case's start, he'd believed the Megantic River held part of the answer. The Jeep tire tracks dug deep into the mud, stopping at the water's edge, not random. No ordinary person drives to the frozen midnight docks unless discarding something. Two divers in thick rubber suits, oxygen tanks strapped on, slowly immersed in the icy water. Each breath expelled white vapor clouds. Doyle stood by, timing with his stopwatch, while Officer Miller sketched positions by hand. They dove upriver, area about 500 meters from the health center. Bay winds blew against them, fog rising in patches, veiling the surface. 10 minutes passed, only the faint hum of the rescue boat's motor on the water. Then one diver surfaced, signaling with his hand. A rope was hauled up from below, heavy with metallic clinks against wood. When the object reached the bank, Doyle knelt, a brown leather bag, waterlogged, brass clasp, rusted but intact. On the flap, AP embossed faintly under seaweed crust. He recognized it instantly, Alexine Penrose's personal medicine pouch, the type issued to each nurse for shifts. Doyle removed his gloves, wiped mud with a dry cloth, and unclasped it. Inside, water dripped out with a sharp antiseptic stench. 6 small glass vials, red waxed caps, paper labels still legible. Doyle picked one up, eyes narrowing. Prescribed by Dr. Matthew Carver, December 14, 49. Tranquilizer Compound B. The room fell silent for seconds. Miller murmured, "Sir, this is an official prescription?" Doyle replied dryly, "No, the health center doesn't have this type in the prescription records." He signaled to seal the bag, placed it in the evidence box, and sent it straight to the Knox County Forensics Lab. That afternoon, a temporary analysis room was set up right at the Camden Police Headquarters. A technician used a magnifying glass to examine the wax on each vial. Under the light, the wax appeared smooth and glossy, without any old cracks, indicating it had been resealed very close to the time the bag fell into the water. Doyle stood beside, silently observing. When the technician rolled silver powder onto the vial bodies, a clear set of fingerprints emerged. matching exactly with Dr. Carver's sample from the health center's personnel file. No traces of Alexine, no marks from anyone else. All 6 medicine vials bore Carver's fingerprints. Doyle leaned against the wall, eyes still fixed on the row of glass vials gleaming under the light. He didn't need to say it. Everyone understood. The only person who had touched these vials after they were sealed was Carver. A nurse would never let her medicine bag fall into the river. A doctor had no reason to reseal fresh medicine and then throw it away. There was only one possibility. The truth was that someone had deliberately staged the scene. That afternoon, Doyle went to Carver's house, a quiet white wooden home overlooking the sea. Carver opened the door, his composure chillingly calm. Doyle showed him a photo of the medicine bag and asked curtly, "Do you recognize this?" Carver glanced at it and nodded slightly. "Yes, it's Alexine's. She kept it in the duty room. I've never touched it." Doyle looked at him without blinking. "Then why are your fingerprints all over the vials inside?" Carver paused briefly, then replied, "I might have helped her replace the caps when the medicine leaked. That happens often." Doyle didn't respond, just pocketed the photo. "I need you to stay in town until we finish the tests." Carver just nodded, voice low. "I'm not going anywhere." As Doyle left the house, light snow began to fall. He paused by the wooden fence, turning to look at the Willys Jeep, parked in Carver's yard, the mud under the chassis still not dry. A strong gust blew through, rattling the car door. In Doyle's mind, everything was becoming clear. The matching tire tracks, the glove mark on the glass, and now the bag under the water, all leading to one man. That evening in his small office, Doyle sat looking at the spread-out map. A red line connected from the health center to the harbor, exactly the path the Jeep had taken. He circled the area where the medicine bag was found, noting beside it 2 short words, "Dump point." When he set down the pen, he looked up through the sealed window. Night fog rolled in again, blanketing the town, as if to hide every trace of that night. But now, to him, Alexine Penrose's disappearance had completely changed color. This was no longer an accident. It was an elaborate cover-up. Under the dim yellow light, Doyle closed his eyes, telling himself, "Carver doesn't just know what happened, he's the one who made it happen." Winter 1950 passed in heavy silence. The Meganticook River gradually froze over, swallowing all traces of the previous season. After more than 2 months of fruitless searching, the dive team finally had to withdraw. No body, no additional evidence was found beyond the medicine bag that had been tested to exhaustion. Forensics reports back then were rudimentary, not enough basis to determine when the bag was thrown into the water, nor to prove who did it. Though the details around the case left Sheriff William Doyle uneasy, he was forced to sign the short summary line, "Missing, presumed, drowned." On paper, Alexine Penrose was officially considered a victim of a river accident. In the weeks that followed, the town of Camden gradually returned to its old rhythm. Snow fell thicker, the docks grew emptier, and the small health center where Alexine had worked reopened. Her duty room was cleaned, the desk replaced, but the small crack at the base of the wall remained, painted over as if to forget. No one mentioned the night of the disappearance anymore, except occasionally when people saw Sheriff Doyle quietly stopping by the center, standing outside the window looking in before leaving without a word. Dr. Matthew Carver continued practicing in Camden. He still saw patients, still made rounds to nearby health posts in that same old Willys Jeep. The townspeople trusted him, a quiet, dedicated doctor, always ready to come to any home in the middle of a storm. No one mentioned Nurse Penrose's disappearance anymore. Only occasionally, when the east wind blew through the bay and the fog lingered longer than usual, people whispered that her spirit still lingered somewhere by the docks. As for Doyle, though the case was closed, he never considered it truly ended. Every time he passed the wooden bridge, he still clearly remembered the chill when touching the soaked leather bag embossed, AP, and the vials bearing Carver's name. But the evidence back then wasn't enough. Fingerprints, tire tracks, glove marks, all were just scattered pieces in an era without modern verification methods. He had once tried to send evidence to the state lab, but the file was returned for lack of basis to expand investigation. In 1951, Doyle retired early due to lung disease, carrying with him the unresolved torment of the case. Before leaving the police station, he handed the entire Penrose file to the Knox County Archives. Numbered Case 4912A, the cover simply labeled 3 words: Unresolved File. In the years that followed, the file lay dormant in the steel cabinet, gradually gathering dust, and Carver, the once suspected man, became a respected figure. He joined the State Medical Association, opened his own clinic in Bangor, mentioned in local papers as the doctor lifelong devoted to Maine's coast. On the surface, life flowed on as if the December night in 1949 had never happened. But deep in the silent files at Knox, each yellowed page still held the statements, tire track photos and images of the discolored leather bag. For half a century after that, no one reopened that file. Those involved gradually passed away, memories of the disappearance buried with time. Only in 2003, when Maine's Old Records digitization project was launched, was the file numbered 4912A pulled from the cabinet. And it was then that the secrets Doyle had suspected but couldn't prove began to come back to light. 2003. More than half a century had passed since the winter night Nurse Alexine Penrose vanished from the Camden Health Center. On the U.S. map, the case was just a small line in the cold case, missing persons list, stored in the Knox County Archives. In the musty basement of the Maine State Police Building, there hundreds of dusty files stacked in rusted steel cabinets, each an unsolved case, each an unanswered question. In February 2003, the state launched the Maine Cold Case Digitization Project, a program to digitize pre-1960 missing persons files. Goal: scan all evidence, input DNA and image data for future investigations. A team of young technicians was sent to Knox for inventory, including 24-year-old intern Ellen Mathers. Ellen was the first to open the steel cabinet labeled 4912A, the Penrose file. She knew nothing of the story, just saw a thick file cover clamped with frayed twine. When she opened it, she found faded black and white photos, handwritten statements from Sheriff William Doyle, and a cloth bag of evidence. Inside the bag was a white cloth glove, a brown leather pouch embossed AP, 6 empty medicine vials, and a small metal object mixed among the old documents. Ellen picked it up, brushed off the fine dust, a dull brass button, engraved with 2 initials, MC, on the inside. She noted the evidence code, but when cross-checking the inventory, there was no entry for this button. No photos, no logs, no one had ever mentioned it. It might have fallen into the evidence bag during sealing, or been overlooked during sorting. Ellen placed it on the table under fluorescent light, turning it slightly. On the outer edge, faint scratches remained, scratches from hard impact, not natural wear. She hesitated a moment, then decided to add a note, unknown brass button, engraved MC, and reported it to the project supervisor. 2 weeks later, Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell, of the Maine State Police Cold Case Unit, was notified of the find. She had years of experience in archival evidence analysis, specializing in identifying origins of unidentified objects. When she received the Knox report, O'Donnell was intrigued. Most buttons from that era weren't personalized with initials, unless from military medical uniforms or doctors. She requested the entire evidence bag be sent to the Augusta lab for re-examination with modern technology. When the evidence box arrived, O'Donnell personally broke the seal. A musty smell rose, mingled with old scents of leather and antiseptic. She gloved up, carefully lifted the button from the cloth bag, and placed it on a steel tray. The MC engraving was worn but clear under the light. O'Donnell took magnified photos, then examined it under a microscope. The brass surface had green patina, and around the edge clung tiny white fibers, cotton polyester blend, like fabric used in 1940s nurse uniforms. She leaned back in her chair, looking at the initials again. Matthew Carver. The name appeared in the original file like a faint shadow. The doctor, the last witness, and the one who prescribed the medicine in the victim's bag. No one had ever charged him, but professional instinct told O'Donnell that this button wasn't accidentally overlooked. That afternoon, she reviewed the entire scanned Penrose case file. Scene photos, Jeep tire tracks, glove print on the glass, skid mark on the floor. Doyle's statement clearly noted suspicion of Carver, but lack of evidence. O'Donnell paused at Doyle's description. Carver's coat shoulder had brass buttons engraved with letters, Navy style. She tapped her pen on the table. Every detail matched perfectly. Without hesitation, O'Donnell contacted the state lab, requesting DNA testing on any residue on the metal sample. Goal: extract epithelial cells, possibly trapped in the engraving grooves. With the new 2003 YSGR technique, just a few cells were enough to identify the Y chromosome, genetic markers unique to males. That evening, she sat alone in her small office, looking through the glass to the snow-covered parking lot. Outside, patrol cars reflected red lights on the ice. In her hand, the magnified button photo still clearly showed MC. O'Donnell murmured to herself, almost whispering, "If this really is yours, Dr. Carver, then for 54 years, you never escaped the place where she vanished." The next day, the button sample was sent for analysis, and in just a few weeks, the results would return, opening the next chapter of the case. William Doyle had taken to his grave the disappearance of Nurse Alexine Penrose in 1949, now beginning to breathe again. The brass button sample was transferred to the Augusta Forensics Lab in early March 2003 in a sealed specialized envelope labeled Case 4912A, Penrose. The technicians opened the bag in a sterile room, gloved and masked, placing the evidence on a steel tray. Under fluorescent light, the MC engraved button reflected a faint green sheen. Inside the engraving grooves, fine dust and metal corrosion had crusted, but that's exactly where they hoped tiny biological traces remained. Technician Lydia Brandt, a specialist in ancient evidence analysis, used tweezers to pick out each speck of brass dust, dropping it into a test tube with a new cell separation solution developed for cold cases. After 3 hours of processing, the solution turned clear, ready for DNA extraction. The YSTR method, a variant for identifying Y chromosome chains, was chosen as it could detect male traces even if the remaining material was 1,000th the size of a grain of sand. The machine run took nearly 14 hours. When the results appeared on the screen, Lydia saw a characteristic Y code sequence of 17 complete repeats, indicating the sample was strong enough for comparison. She saved the data, tagging it MC button sample. The sample was sent directly to the Maine State Genetic Database Center, storing tens of thousands of old DNA samples from civil and medical records. 3 days later, the system flagged an automatic match. The button's YSTR code matched exactly with blood sample from Dr. Matthew Carver, stored in the state medical file from 1978, when he donated blood for a community drive. The database confirmed the random match probability, less than 1 in 100 billion. No mistake possible. When notified, Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell was at the lab immediately. She looked at the 10-page printout where genetic characters lined up like undeniable coordinates. Lydia said just one short sentence, "It's his." O'Donnell nodded, silent. Memories of the Penrose case flooded her mind. The black and white photos, Jeep tire tracks, glove print on the glass. Everything Sheriff Doyle suspected in 1950 was now proven by scientific evidence. That afternoon, O'Donnell went to the archives to retrieve all related evidence. When she placed the button next to an old 1949 photo of Carver, she saw he wore a Navy-style coat with shiny brass buttons, exactly the type of evidence on the table. In the photo, one button on the left shoulder was slightly loose, and now it lay before her, dusted by time. She brought the results to the cold case unit commander, Captain Robert Myers. Upon hearing the report, he was silent a long time, then said only, "So Doyle was right. They just lacked our era." Then Myers signed the reactivation document for Case 4912A, shifting the file from archived to reopened investigation. Within 24 hours, all documents, Scene photos and old evidence were transferred to the cold case unit headquarters in Augusta. O'Donnell began combing every detail: the glove print on the door glass, the floor skid mark, the Jeep tire tracks, all fit one scenario. Carver was in Alexine's duty room on the night of December 15, 1949. The brass button fell off during a struggle, clung to a nurse uniform fiber, then got swept into her bag out of the room. No one noticed because DNA identification didn't exist then. And for over half a century, it lay silent in the cloth bag, waiting for technology to catch up with time. That night, alone in her office, O'Donnell opened her computer to review scene photos scanned from microfilm. Under the yellow light, she paused at the photo of Alexine's old desk. On the table edge, the small crack Doyle had noted was still clear. She zoomed in on the image area, then flipped to a 1950 photo of Carver, the coat, the brass buttons, the gleam on the shoulder. Everything matched perfectly like the final pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. O'Donnell turned off the screen, leaned back in her chair, eyes resting on the small evidence box on the table. A cold, strange feeling rose in her, like the sensation that only comes when truth is about to emerge from the shadows. The MC engraved button was no longer a meaningless metal shard, but direct evidence proving Carver had been at the scene where Alexine Penrose vanished 54 years earlier. The next morning, the cold case unit officially issued an internal notice. The Alexine Penrose disappearance investigation was reactivated. A case thought sunk in the past now lived again. Starting with a tiny detail an entire previous era had overlooked: a button fallen in the cold night of 1949, and a DNA chain that never lied. With the DNA results from the button in hand, Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell knew she had a solid foundation to reconstruct the winter night of 1949. The night nurse Alexine Penrose vanished. In the fluorescent-lit office, she spread out photocopies of the original file pages, handwritten by Sheriff William Doyle. The faded ink lines, interspersed with red unresolved marks, now became the foundation for the new investigation. Beside them was a 1949 map of Camden town, streets still unchanged to this day. The small health center at the corner of Main Street, the dirt road leading to Rockport Harbor, just under a mile long, ending at the old wooden bridge overlooking the bay. O'Donnell used a red marker to connect key points: Health Center, Camp Harbor Tavern, Harbor Bridge. Based on original statements and reports, she began rebuilding the movement timeline for the night of December 15, 1949. 9 o'clock, 9:30 p.m. Camp Harbor Tavern witnesses confirm Alexine arrived with friends, then Dr. Matthew Carver entered. The two talked briefly, Carver seemingly reassuring her. 10:10, 10:15 p.m. Frank Delaney, the tavern owner, remembered clearly because the tavern clock chimed 10:15 when they left together. 10:25, 10:30 p.m. Neighbor near the health center saw Jeep headlights turn off right in front of the center door. Two figures present. 10:40 p.m. Switchboard operator logged an intra-county call from the health center, lasting 32 seconds. A woman's panicked voice, content unclear, likely Alexine's distress call. 11 p.m. Harbor witnesses heard a vehicle engine and a car door slam hard. Then, absolute silence. O'Donnell marked each milestone with red pen on the map. When connected, she spotted a 30-minute gap between Carver's statement and actual facts. In his 1949 statement, Carver said he left the tavern at 9:45 and was home before 10 o'clock. But witnesses all confirmed they left after 10:15, and Jeep lights appeared at the health center around 10:30. That empty time was the question mark Doyle had noted but couldn't prove. To test the hypothesis, O'Donnell coordinated with the cold case unit forensics team to simulate the travel route using 3D reconstruction software. They input 1949 Camden terrain data, average speed of a Willys Jeep on dirt roads, and distances between locations. The results displayed on screen: the drive from Camp Harbor to the health center took 7 minutes, from the health center to the bridge another 4 minutes. If Carver left the tavern at 10:15, he would arrive at the health center at 10:22, and be at the bridge around 10:30, 10:35, exactly when the neighbor and harbor witnesses heard the vehicle. O'Donnell stood watching the 3D model projected on the wall, Jeep lights moving slowly along the fog-shrouded road, stopping at the health center, then slowly advancing to the bridge. She murmured, "He never went home at 10 like he claimed." Next, the tech team reconstructed possible confrontation positions. Based on old scene photos, floor skid under the table, glove print on the glass, and wood molding crack, they built an accurate scale duty room diagram. Force trajectory analysis showed a collision occurred beside the desk, toward the window, perfectly matching the glove print direction. This reinforced the hypothesis that Alexine was pushed or held back while trying to open the door. Carver's brass button likely fell off in that exact moment, clinging to a nurse uniform fiber, then following her bag out of the room. For further verification, O'Donnell requested extraction of old satellite photos, 1949 Air Force shots, and matched current terrain. The harbor location where the medicine bag was found and the tire track area aligned almost perfectly. The small path to the water's edge back then had no barriers wide enough for a Jeep to stop and turn. A sudden brake mark, noted in the old log, now became evidence of hasty action, possibly when Carver threw the bag into the river and left. That afternoon, upon completing the simulation, O'Donnell called the full team to meet. On the large screen, the 3D simulation displayed along the timeline, 10:15. Carver and Alexine leave Camp Harbor, 10:22. The Jeep stops in front of the health center, lights off, 10:40. Distress call from the center, 10:50. Jeep appears at the bridge, 11 o'clock. Complete silence. Each frame is a precise slice of time, something no one had seen for 54 years. When the model stopped at the final scene, the Jeep vanishing into the fog, blanketing the harbor, the meeting room fell utterly silent. O'Donnell looked at her colleagues, voice low but firm. "With this evidence, we can confirm Matthew Carver was at the harbor the night Alexine Penrose vanished. Not by chance, not by misunderstanding. He was there, right when everything ended." A moment of silence passed, only the hum of the projector remaining. The light shone on O'Donnell's face, reflecting in her sharp, cold eyes. After more than half a century, the timeline of the 1949 case had finally been filled in, and at its endpoint, only the name Matthew Carver stood alone in the Maine fog, before the river that had buried every trace of him for 54 years. The Maine State Forensics Lab blazed with white lights as Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell carried the old evidence box out of the sealed storage. Inside, after more than half a century, Nurse Alexine Penrose's brown leather medicine bag embossed AP remained terrifyingly intact. The stitching cracked but the brass clasp still tight, the scent of damp leather and antiseptic lingering faintly, as if it had just been pulled from the water yesterday. Each vial inside, manually sealed by Sheriff Doyle in 1949, was now reopened by O'Donnell with sterile tools. She knew that if the DNA from the button had placed Carver back at the scene, this medicine bag would reveal when he had touched it, and possibly after Alexine was no longer alive. The technicians began modern fingerprint examination using cyanoacrylate fuming, allowing latent prints to be visualized even on water-soaked evidence. As white vapor from the reaction chamber adhered to the glass surfaces, swirling ridge patterns gradually emerged, sharper than any previous capture. Compared to the 1949 file sample, all matched exactly with Dr. Matthew Carver's fingerprints, no other prints present. But what caught O'Donnell's attention wasn't just the identity, but the print positions on the sealing wax caps of all 6 vials. The prints overlaid the fresh wax, indicating the toucher had handled them directly after sealing, not during preparation as Carver had claimed. Next, they analyzed the red sealing wax using Raman spectroscopy. The results showed wax containing a paraffin and azo red dye mixture, the type used in 1940s sealing materials, but more specifically, traces of magnesium carbonate additive, only appearing in a shipment of wax imported through Portland Harbor in December 1949, recorded in a medical supplies invoice signed by Carver himself. O'Donnell was silent as she viewed the comparison, feeling the boundary between suspicion and proof beginning to dissolve. Meanwhile, the chemical analysis team examined residual liquid in one vial. They isolated a mixture of high-concentration barbiturate and morphine traces, a formula similar to the custom sedative Carver had prescribed for post-surgical patients. Tracing old state pharmaceutical purchase records, exactly one batch of the same composition had been imported by Carver for the Camden Health Center 2 days before Alexine's disappearance. On each vial, the handwritten label read Compound B, the 14th of December 49, matching exactly the date in Carver's prescription log. O'Donnell held one vial in her hand, her finger lightly tracing the neat slanted black ink script. Under the microscope, they discovered a small gray thread fiber clinging to the vial neck, the same type as the stitching in Carver's coat preserved in 1949 photos. No signs of hasty disposal damage on the vials. On the contrary, all were carefully sealed, as if someone had deliberately staged an image of a woman preparing to leave, medicine bag, medical items, everything neat, as if she had vanished on her own. When the report was complete, the forensics team presented to the cold case unit. Under dim lights, magnified images appeared on the screen, Carver's fingerprints overlaying fresh wax. Handwritten signature on labels matching Carver's 1949 sample. Chemical analysis showing drugs from the batch he imported. O'Donnell pointed to the screen, voice lowering. This shows Carver touched and resealed these vials after they were prepared, meaning after Alexine could no longer do so. A technician added, she couldn't have taken the bag to the harbor herself. The only fingerprints are Carver's. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the implications. The button evidence proved he was in the duty room. The wax fingerprints proved he handled evidence after the disappearance, and the drug batch confirmed only he controlled the source. O'Donnell said slowly, if his 1949 statement said he didn't see her again after the shift, then these vials are the past's answer, an answer that can't be faked. That night, O'Donnell brought a copy of the results to her office, reopening the 3D Jeep route simulation on screen. The vehicle lights pierced the health center, then stopped at the harbor. She imagined Carver in the car, medicine bag on the seat beside him, hand holding a still warm wax cap. She didn't know exactly what happened between them in the duty room, a struggle, a threat, or panic, but the physical evidence spoke for what no statement dared admit. O'Donnell closed the file, looking down at a 1948 medical ID photo of young Carver, stern face, bright eyes, no one imagining he could kill. She told herself, almost in a breath, you touched the medicine bag after she was gone, then staged it all to make everyone think she vanished on her own. As the room lights dimmed, the evidence box remained quietly on the table, heavy with weight. After more than half a century, it was no longer a forgotten item. It had become the final piece shattering a 54-year lie, turning Dr. Matthew Carver from last witness to sole suspect in the Alexine Penrose disappearance. April 2003, Bangor was unusually cold despite spring's arrival. Fine rain dotted the old rooftops, wind scattering dry leaves along the main street. Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell and 2 cold case unit investigators drove to Dr. Matthew Carver's clinic, the man who for half a century had been the town's model of morality and dedication. The front glass door bore gold-lettered words, Dr. M. Carver, Family Practice, since 1951. O'Donnell stood still for a few seconds, looking at the inscription before pushing the door open. The bell above the frame tinkled softly. The waiting room air carried the familiar antiseptic scent, the same that had lingered in Alexine's duty room in 1949. Carver emerged from the back room, steps slow, silver hair neatly combed. At 89, he still retained the sternness of a doctor accustomed to command. Seeing the 3 in suits and state police badges, he paused, eyes going blank for a moment. I suppose the old case is being brought up again, he said, voice hoarse but calm. O'Donnell nodded. Yes, doctor. We need to confirm some points about Nurse Alexine Penrose's disappearance. May we sit and talk a bit? Carver gave a faint smile. Half a century later, and you still think I remember. The small office, walls hung with plaques and old photos. On the desk, still the silver stethoscope and a notebook with pen clipped to the side, everything arranged meticulously, like a ritual. O'Donnell opened her notepad, voice even. You stated that on the evening of December 15th, 1949, you met Alexine at Camp Harbor Tavern, then drove her back to the health center and left before 10 p.m. Do you stand by that statement? Carver nodded. I remember clearly. She was upset. Said she had issues with her boyfriend. I advised her to take a few days off. I didn't see her after that. O'Donnell looked straight at him. Do you know why we're here, Dr. Carver? Carver smiled lightly, trying to keep his voice steady. I assume you found something new in those old files. O'Donnell didn't answer immediately. She pulled from her briefcase an enlarged photo, the button engraved MC. She placed it before him. This was found in the Penrose evidence bag. DNA on the surface matches your blood sample, exactly. Stored from the 1978 blood drive. Carver frowned, squinting closely, then leaned back in his chair. My button? I had a dozen like that. It doesn't prove anything. It could have fallen from an old coat in the office. They mixed it up. O'Donnell didn't respond. She took out another photo. 6 red waxed medicine vials. The script, prescribed by Dr. Matthew Carver, December 14, 49. And this is the medicine from Alexine's bag. Your fingerprints are on the fresh wax. The wax you bought separately from Portland Harbor, 2 days before she vanished. Chemical analysis shows it's the same batch you imported for the health center. Carver stared at the photo. For a few seconds, he said nothing, just lightly tapping his finger on the desk. Then he smiled, voice deepening. She had a history of depression. I just helped her with sleeping pills. Maybe she went off somewhere, or, I don't know, but I did nothing wrong. The air in the room grew heavy. O'Donnell kept her direct gaze, face unchanged. You said you didn't see her again after leaving the center, but scientific evidence says otherwise. Your fingerprints on fresh wax, your DNA on the button that fell in the duty room, and your Jeep's tire tracks at the harbor where the medicine bag was found. Do you have anything to say before we hand the file to the court? Carver raised his head, eyes suddenly darkening. He no longer looked at O'Donnell, but turned to the window, where rain still fell steadily. A minute, 2 minutes passed. The wall clock ticked softly, counting each second. O'Donnell said nothing, just noted a short line in her pad. Carver sighed, voice weary. You don't understand. Back then, things were so different from now. I just wanted to help her. She was scared, out of control. I didn't mean to. His voice trailed off, then stopped. He cleared his throat lightly, shook his head. Enough. I'm old. Saying anything now is pointless. O'Donnell closed her pad, stood up. No, doctor, it's not pointless. Silence is sometimes the clearest answer. She signaled her team to gather the files. Carver didn't react, just sat still, eyes gazing distantly out at the gray sky. As they left the room, O'Donnell heard him murmur, almost to himself, I just wanted to help her calm down. That's all. The police car left Bangor as night fell. Rain still poured heavily, reflecting the city's faint red lights. In the car, O'Donnell opened her notebook, writing the final line of the interview. Subject denies, uncooperative, but silent before DNA evidence. Note, silence confirms. She set down her pen, looking up through the windshield, voice soft enough for only herself. After 54 years, the truth finally knows its way back. The next morning, the cold case unit submitted the file and requested an official arrest warrant for Dr. Matthew Carver, charged with murder and concealment of a body in the 1949 disappearance of Nurse Alexine Penrose. Bangor, 2 days after the arrest warrant. Dr. Matthew Carver sat alone in the interrogation room, hands lightly cuffed, a full glass of cold water before him. Fluorescent lights cast down on his pale face, the glow highlighting his weary eyes, still trying to hold dignity. 6 hours had passed since Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell and Investigator Miles began the formal questioning. At first, Carver kept an even tone. "I didn't do anything. She left that night. I don't know where." But as time went on, his voice weakened, silences between answers stretching longer. O'Donnell didn't press. She just placed photos on the table. The MC button, wax fingerprints, medicine bag, Jeep route map, each photo laid down like a needle, stitching back the past he had tried to bury for half a century. "Doctor," O'Donnell said softly, "I think you don't need to pretend anymore. Everything you touched that night, it all still remembers you." Carver looked up, eyes cloudy, behind his glasses. "She was screaming," he said, voice raspy. "I didn't mean to." The room fell silent. Miles glanced at O'Donnell. She nodded slightly, signal to continue. Carver braced his hands on the table, trembling lightly. "I went to the health center after leaving the tavern," he said slowly. "Alex, she wanted to talk about leaving, about telling my wife everything. I begged her not to, but she got angry. We argued. She pushed me. I grabbed her arm. Then she slipped and fell. Hit her head on the table." He paused, drawing a sharp breath, eyes distant as if still seeing the scene. "I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I thought if everyone believed she left, then it would be over." O'Donnell said nothing, letting him continue. "I took her out the back door. Fog was thick. No one saw anything. I drove to Rockport Harbor, the abandoned lumber shed near the dock. There was an old pit. I buried her there. I placed her nurse bag beside her. I couldn't throw it away. It had her name." His voice faded, almost dissolving into the air. "I just wanted time to take care of the rest. But it never forgot me." When he stopped, the wall clock showed nearly midnight. 6 hours gone, and finally the confession no one had heard for over half a century. O'Donnell looked at him, voice calm. "Are you willing to show us the location?" Carver nodded, eyes closing. "Yes. I remember exactly." The next morning, the police convoy left Bangor, escorting Carver back to Rockport Harbor, once a bustling lumber dock area, now just rows of abandoned sheds amid weeds. The sky was thick gray, cold sea wind whipping faces. Carver sat in the back seat, hands cuffed in front, eyes gazing through the fogged window. Upon arrival, he stepped down slowly, supported by 2 officers. O'Donnell followed, holding the old map excerpt from Doyle's file, the exact spot he had noted. Old lumber shed south of the dock. Carver stopped before a flat patch of ground, where an old pine tree grew crooked over a collapsed shed roof. He pointed toward it, voice hoarse, under the tree roots. 3 steps from the trunk, west direction. O'Donnell signaled the forensics team to start digging. Shovel blades hit soil, mingling with distant waves. The first layer peeled away, releasing damp, rotten wood smells. Then someone called out, "Got something." A corner of dark leather bag emerged from the earth, brass clasp, rusted but still showing AP clearly. The forensics team expanded the pit. Soon after, a human bone segment, the skull and clavicle were carefully lifted in specialized nylon bags. Beside them, they found a nurse badge engraved AP and a broken stethoscope. O'Donnell knelt, looking at evidence the 1949 police had never found. She knew this was the endpoint of the path Doyle had begun half a century ago. Carver stood a few meters away, flanked by 2 officers. He looked down at the pit, lips trembling but saying nothing. When O'Donnell turned back, he uttered one near whisper, "I didn't mean to kill her, I just wanted to stop her from leaving." O'Donnell replied, voice cold yet sad, "But you buried her, doctor, and you let the whole town believe she vanished." The forensics team finished collecting samples. The remains were transported to the lab, the site sealed. As Carver was led back to the car, sea wind billowed his thin coat, exposing skinny wrists still gleaming with cuffs under the sun. He turned his head for a final look at the lumber shed, where the earth had just been refilled, then closed his eyes. That evening at Cold Case Unit headquarters, O'Donnell wrote the final line in the report, "Body location of Alexine Penrose identified, Rockport Harbor. Evidence matches 1949 file. Case officially converted to murder case." Suspect Dr. Matthew Carver. After more than half a century, the mysterious Camden disappearance was no longer a fog-shrouded tale, but real crime, and finally the truth had been dug up from the very ground where he once thought it would stay buried forever. Maine State Forensics Lab, 1 week after the Rockport Harbor exhumation. In the 10-degree cold chamber, the forensics team began examining the remains just confirmed as Nurse Alexine Penrose's. On the steel table, bone fragments were laid out neatly, each section tagged with a number card. White exam lights gleamed, reflecting off the broken stethoscope's metal frame, evidence found beside the clavicle. Every object here, after more than half a century, still held a piece of that December 1949 night. Forensic pathologist Dr. Thomas Gray, lead on the examination, started with bone dating analysis. He took small samples from the femur and skull, using carbon-14 isotope spectroscopy to measure the last formation date. Results with error under 4 years, age around late 1940s, perfectly matching Alexine's disappearance time. The bones were sturdy, high calcium density, indicating the victim was in her early 30s, just as described in the original file. No doubt, this was her. Next, the team analyzed fabric remnants found around the remains. Some cloth scraps still clung to neck and shoulder bones, ivory gray, examined under electron microscope. Fibers woven from cotton rayon blend, 4x1 twill structure, standard U.S. nurse uniform type from 1948. A notch at the collar matched where the brass button had fallen off, discovered in the evidence bag. Comparison with the MC button showed scratch edges on the brass rim, aligning with the fabric fiber break, proving the button popped off during impact. But the most crucial evidence came from skull trauma examination. The right rear skull had a 6.3 centimeters arc-shaped fracture, radiating from the occipital fossa to the temporal. Under magnification, the break edges showed depressed cracking, characteristic of blunt force trauma from a solid object, not a random fall. Dr. Gray pointed to the 3D CT scan image on screen. Force direction top-down, from rear right, consistent with victim being pushed backward while facing the perpetrator. The left ribs bore old fractures, non-fatal, but indicating a brief struggle and restraining force. O'Donnell was present in the observation room, watching the skull projection on the large screen. Every detail from the 1949 file now had explanation. Floor skid marks, glove print on glass, all pointing to a fall after argument, not natural accident. She asked, "Chance of instant death?" Gray nodded. "Almost certain, the occipital fracture sufficient for acute intracranial hemorrhage. She couldn't have left on her own after this injury." After bone analysis, the forensics team examined accompanying evidence, AP badge, nurse bag, broken stethoscope, and AP engraved medicine pouch found just inches from the body. Everything matched positions, leather bag at left hip, stethoscope on chest, arranged exactly as described in the 1949 report of items she carried on her final shift. Soil residue tests on the bag showed mineral content, matching samples from the Camden Health Center, proving the bag was taken from the center that night, not dropped in water as once assumed. When all the evidence was pieced together, the Carver button, the resealed medicine bag, the fingerprints, and the victim's remains, O'Donnell reconstructed the entire sequence of events on the board. Each piece of evidence was a link in the chain. The MC button proves Carver was present in the duty room during the struggle. The freshly sealed medicine bag and fingerprints show he handled the evidence after Alexine was gone. The body at Rockport, with skull trauma consistent with fall after argument. The AP badge, uniform fabric, and burial position match Carver's final statement exactly. "This is a complete logical chain," O'Donnell said during the internal briefing. "No gaps left. Every piece, though separated by 54 years, fits into a straight line." She looked at the old 1949 photo of Carver, the young doctor with a confident smile, then back at the portrait taken just days ago, aged, weary, eyes still holding the dark shadow of a man who never escaped his guilt. Dr. Gray concluded firmly, time of death consistent with the night of December 15, 1949. Based on injuries, this is death by traumatic brain injury from forceful impact. Homicide, not accident. He signed the report, the final note reading, evidence conclusively supports homicide. When she received the thick stack of reports, O'Donnell stood still for a moment. Outside, April snow flurried lightly on the window, melting quickly like water dust. Every detail Doyle had suspected, every piece of evidence time had blurred, now said the same thing. Alexine Penrose didn't disappear. She was killed, and her killer was Matthew Carver. Half a century ago, technology wasn't enough to speak the truth. But now, in the age of DNA and trace analysis, science had answered for those who had stayed silent. And with that closed chain of evidence, the 1949 disappearance officially became a murder case, ending 54 years of darkness over the town of Camden. Early morning on the first day of November, 2003, Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell walked into the Knox County Prosecutor's office, clutching a nearly 200-page file tightly. After months of tracing back the past, every piece from the MC button, the brown leather medicine bag, the fingerprints, to the bone examination results, had connected into an irrefutable chain. On the cover, in bold print, State of Maine v. Matthew Carver, case hash 4912A. Inside, every page was evidence that William Doyle back then could only dream of. In the quiet conference room, Prosecutor Arthur Blake skimmed through each section, occasionally pausing at the 3D skull examination photo or the image of the red-waxed medicine bag bearing Carver's fingerprints. He looked up at O'Donnell, not just sufficient but overwhelming. "Are you sure you want to proceed with criminal prosecution? He's nearly 90. O'Donnell replied succinctly, "Age doesn't change the truth. And the truth has no statute of limitations." Blake nodded, signing the final document. The words stood clear. Arrest warrant issued November 11, 2003. Charge, first-degree murder. The next morning, at 7:32 a.m., the Cold Case Unit Task Force, along with Bangor Police, arrived at the small lakeside wooden house where Carver had lived for the last 30 years of his life. The air was crisp and cold, mist rising from the lake, reflecting the faint sunlight. When they knocked, Carver opened immediately, as if he had known they were coming. He wore a gray sweater and slacks, showing no surprise. O'Donnell stood at the doorstep, voice firm but not raised. "Dr. Matthew Carver, by order of the Knox County Court, you are under arrest for first-degree murder in the Alexine Penrose case, occurring in December 1949. Carver looked at her, eyes neither defiant nor pleading. He nodded slightly, back slightly hunched, hands extended forward as if ready. As the cuffs clicked shut, he said softly, voice almost a breath, "I've lived with it my whole life, Inspector O'Donnell. You don't need to remind me." The words made everyone pause in a moment of silence. Neighbors gathered at the roadside, watching as the police car slowly rolled away. Many couldn't believe it. The dedicated doctor, who had delivered dozens of babies around Bangor, now handcuffed and taken away. In the car, Carver sat still, eyes gazing out the window, where red-tinged trees receded behind. O'Donnell sat across from him, saying nothing. She knew that silence was the only thing left of him, not resistance, but acceptance. At Knox County Police Headquarters, Carver was placed in a private holding cell. During the health check, he remained alert, requesting only a hot cup of tea. When O'Donnell arrived to sign the detention papers, he looked at her once more, smiling faintly. "You know, I once thought time would help people forget. But it turns out, it just makes them remember longer." O'Donnell replied, "Time doesn't erase guilt, doctor. It just waits until people are brave enough to face it." At 11 a.m. that day, the Bangor Radio News announced Maine State Police have arrested Dr. Matthew Carver, 89, for murder in the 1949 disappearance of nurse Alexine Penrose, a case thought forever unsolved. The short bulletin was enough to stir the entire state. For O'Donnell, After nearly a year of investigation, that moment wasn't a victory, but the completion of a circle, the circle Doyle had begun sketching half a century ago. And she had just closed with an arrest warrant signed on the morning of November 11, 2003. Knox County Interrogation Room, morning of November 12, 2003. Outside, light rain fell, droplets lingering on the steel doorframe, creating a steady tapping rhythm. Inside, Dr. Matthew Carver sat on the metal chair, the collar of his old gray sweater chafing lightly against the cuffs. Across from him, Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell and Investigator Miles started the recorder, turned on the camera. She stated clearly, "This interrogation is being fully audio and video recorded. Mr. Carver, are you giving this statement voluntarily?" He nodded, voice low and raspy. "No one's forcing me. I've lived with it long enough." O'Donnell opened her notebook, but this time, she didn't need to ask much. Carver began recounting, details fragmented, voice even and slow as if reading an old report. "That night, I went to the health center after leaving Camp Harbor. Alexine was furious. She said she was leaving Camden, and if I didn't tell my wife the truth, she would. I tried to calm her, but she wouldn't listen. I said, 'Don't go,' then she pushed me. I grabbed her shoulder. She slipped and fell, head hitting the table corner. That sound, I'll never forget it." He paused briefly, sunken eyes, hands trembling as they clasped tightly on the table. O'Donnell stayed silent, letting him continue. "I knelt to check. She wasn't breathing. There was a small streak of blood at the back of her head. I thought, what do I do now? If I called the police, who would believe me? I was the last one there, and I had a family." He shook his head slightly. "I wiped the blood with a cloth, tidied the room. I put the cloth scrap and the vials on the table into her bag. I wanted everyone to think she left that night." Miles asked, "The medicine in the bag, you prescribed it?" Carver nodded. "I resealed them myself, so if they found it, it would look like her things. I even sprinkled some barbiturate around the vials, so when tested, they'd think she intended suicide." He smiled faintly, a weary smile. "Back then, everyone was quick to believe the story of a fragile woman and sleeping pills," Carver continued, voice steadier, almost narrative. "Around 10:30, I carried her to the car. I used the back door of the health center, the side no one sees, then drove to the harbor bridge. Fog was thick, no lights. I stopped near the old lumber shed in Rockport, where they sometimes stacked goods. I knew there was a sunken pit behind the wall, once used to dump sawdust. I dug deep with the shovel I brought. I laid her down, nurse bag beside her. I remember looking at her for a long time, before covering the earth. The night was so quiet I could hear the waves hitting the dock. Then I went home." O'Donnell opened a color-printed map pointing to the location he described. "This, right?" Carver looked, nodding slightly. "Yes, that spot. 3 steps from the pine trunk west, that was exactly where the forensics team had exhumed the remains the week before." She asked, "Next, what did you do with the car afterward?" "Drove home, washed the tires, laundered the coat. One button was loose. I didn't notice. It must have fallen in the room." The statement made O'Donnell shiver briefly. The MC engraved button her team found was the first evidence to reopen the case. Miles asked, "Did you ever return to the scene?" Carver shook his head. "No, I didn't dare. But every night passing the bridge, I heard footsteps. I knew I'd have to speak someday. I just didn't know when." The entire interrogation lasted over 2 hours, captured by 2 wide-angle cameras. No attorney, no coercion, no pressure. Carver didn't request breaks, didn't evade questions. He recounted everything like handing over a burden. At the end, O'Donnell asked the final question. "Anything else you'd like to add?" Carver looked at her, eyes darkening. "I'm no monster, Inspector. I was just a cowardly man. And that cowardice killed her. Not that I wanted to." O'Donnell didn't respond, just signaled to stop the cameras. 2 technicians reviewed the full recording, saved the file, and sealed the videotapes per procedure. Every protocol sheet was signed on the spot. Carver's signature, shaky but clear. As he was escorted back to his cell, Carver turned for a final look at O'Donnell, voice light as a breath. "I buried her twice, once in the ground, and once in my heart." The steel door closed, leaving a long silence outside. In the interrogation room, the light still glowed. The chair Carver had sat in still warm. O'Donnell stood watching the recording rewind. The image of the frail old man, hunched back, skinny hands clenched, mouth recounting old sins, and she knew no more words were needed. Everything he said matched the 2003 forensics results perfectly, down to every detail. Shed location, distance to the bridge, wind direction, even how the medicine bag was placed beside the body. That confession, after 54 years, had completed the arc of truth many thought would never be found. At the Cold Case Unit headquarters in Augusta, a closed meeting was convened immediately after completing the interrogation of Dr. Matthew Carver. The long conference table was covered with documents, scene photos, forensics results, maps, and resealed evidence items. Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell opened the main file, her voice calm but resolute. "We'll synthesize the entire chain of evidence, not chronologically, but logically. Every piece in this case has existed for over half a century. Now it's time they speak with one voice." She began with the brass MC button, the tiny item that unlocked the whole case. "This button proves what Sheriff Doyle in 1949 could only sense. Carver was in the duty room at the moment Alexine was assaulted," she said, placing the enlarged photo on the board. Under the microscope, the scratches around the button matched exactly with nurse uniform fibers found on the victim's shoulder bones. DNA from the brass surface matched Carver's 1978 blood sample, ruling out random coincidence. "This is irrefutable physical presence evidence. He was there, and he clashed with her." Next, O'Donnell pointed to the photo of the brown leather AP medicine bag, evidence once mistaken for a river drop. "This bag is the second linchpin." Carver admitted resealing the vials after Alexine died. His fingerprints are on the fresh wax, not under the old wax, meaning he handled them after sealing, not during compounding. The vials contain the same barbiturate batch he imported to the health center 2 days before the incident, proving they weren't prepared by the victim. She paused, looking around. "This is evidence of staging. He deliberately created a false scene to mislead that Alexine vanished or suicided on her own." The third piece, the body and exhumation scene at Rockport Harbor. O'Donnell turned on the screen, displaying 3D scans of the remains. The right occipital fracture shows direct impact trauma, impossible from a natural slip. Carver claimed Alexine fell after pushing him, and this injury fits that description perfectly. But more crucially, the burial site, the old lumber shed, 3 steps from the pine trunk, matches the forensic simulation exactly. Beside the body were the nurse badge, broken stethoscope and leather bag, arranged in the exact sequence he described, showing no memory lapse, but the recall of a concealer. Finally, the DNA and scene traces, the thread spanning 54 years. O'Donnell opened a slide showing the YSTOR chart, the genetic code matching between the button and Carver's sample. The technology Doyle lacked in 1949 has answered for him now. This genetic sequence is scientific evidence, not intuition, not speculation. It confirms Carver was present, handled evidence, and participated directly in the events leading to Alexine's death. As investigators presented their sections in turn, the logical chain formed clearly. Button Carver present at scene, proving physical clash with victim. Medicine bag Carver acted after victim's death, attempting voluntary departure cover. Body confirms death by impact, not accident or suicide. DNA and Jeep tire tracks matches movement route and body transport, concealment behavior. O'Donnell concluded, "When these pieces connect, we have a seamless chain of actions, 1 struggle leading to death, 2 cleanup and scene staging, 3 body transport to harbor, 4 burial at Rockport Harbor, 5 silence for 54 years. Each piece of evidence, though decades apart, reinforces that structure." Prosecutor Blake looked at the summary board, nodding slightly. No room for doubt. He didn't just cause her death. He sustained the lie his entire life. O'Donnell stood still for a moment, gazing along the arranged evidence row. Button, medicine bag, stethoscope, DNA report, and finally, the photo of remains in the pit. She said slowly, "What killed Alexine wasn't just the fall. It was fear, selfishness, and a lie shielded by reputation." In 1949, people believed Carver because he was the doctor. For 54 years, that lie repeated until it became truth. The room fell utterly silent. Only the wind in the hallway and light reflecting off the glass-covered evidence remained. Finally, O'Donnell closed the file, voice calm. This case was never cold. It just waited for enough evidence to tell its own story. And now, after more than half a century, what was once suspicion, intuition, and faith from an old sheriff had become a complete scientific chain of evidence. Dr. Matthew Carver's concealment, deception, and 54 years of silence were closed, not just by legal charges, but by the final irrefutable truth. The trial of Dr. Matthew Carver opened on the morning of December 8, 2003, at Knox County Courthouse in Maine. Nearly the entire town of Camden followed it, for the case wasn't just one man's story, but the ghost of an era. In the courtroom, aged oak paneling, winter light filtering through tall windows, created a heavy atmosphere. The defendant, the 89-year-old man, sat quietly in the front row, silver hair neatly combed, hands folded neatly on the table. His face was gaunt, eyes deeply sunken, but without fear. He looked straight at the prosecution like a man who had stopped resisting. Prosecutor Arthur Blake opened with a resolute statement. "Today, after 54 years, we are not just trying a criminal case, but judging silence." A man let an entire community believe a fragile woman vanished, while he knew exactly where she lay. His words echoed through the room. In the front row, Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell sat still, the file before her so familiar she could recite it with eyes closed. For the defense, Attorney Daniel Croft, a middle-aged man with a calm voice, countered, "My client had no intent to kill. It was an accident. Miss Penrose slipped during an argument, and in panic, Dr. Carver made a mistake, concealing instead of seeking help. But fear is not a crime." He emphasized each word, hoping to carve a space of human empathy between reason and conscience. Over 2 weeks, the courtroom became a revival of 1949. Forensics experts took the stand one by one, presenting examination results. Dr. Thomas Gray projected 3D scans of Alexine Penrose's skull onto the screen. Under the white light, the arc-shaped fracture appeared as a time-cut gash. He explained to the jury, this injury could only occur if the victim fell backward from a push. This is not a slip-and-fall accident, but directional impact trauma. Next, examiner Lydia Brandt presented the DNA chart. The Y-S-tier sequence on the brass button matches the defendant's blood sample exactly. Random match probability is 1 in 100 billion. That means this button is his, no one else's. The room fell silent, only the scratch of pens on notepads. For the evidence portion, the prosecution screened a map reconstructing Carver's Willys Jeep route. The timeline appeared 10:15 p.m. leaving Camp Harbor, 10:22 stopping at the health center. 10:50 appearing at the harbor, 11 o'clock, absolute silence. Red arrows connected the 3 points, tavern, center, harbor, identical to the 3D model O'Donnell's team had created. Under the projection, evidence emerged, deep tire impressions, glove print on glass, floor skid mark, red waxed medicine bag with Carver's fingerprints. Everything replayed that winter night, right in the courtroom. Prosecutor Blake looked to the jury, voice emphatic. He wasn't just present at the scene. He wiped blood, resealed vials, fabricated a false story. That's not the reaction of an innocent man. That's the calculation of someone who understands science, understands death, and chose to hide it. He held up the medicine bag photo, voice lowering, concealing the truth for 54 years. That's the real crime. The defense countered by emphasizing age and circumstances. He called Carver to the stand. The elderly doctor trembled slightly, holding the microphone, voice steady. I don't deny what I did, but I never wanted her dead. I was just afraid. I was wrong, but not a cold-blooded killer. I've lived in guilt every day. Some in the gallery bowed heads, a few wiped tears. O'Donnell sat unmoving, eyes fixed on him. To her, it was no longer excuse, but an echo of what he said in interrogation. I was just a coward. The trial extended 8 more days. Every piece of evidence was scrutinized, every small detail cross-checked with old files. In closing, Prosecutor Blake stood one last time. No one denies accidents happen, but what made him criminal wasn't the fall, but the choice after. A man with medical knowledge, opportunity to save, chose to bury her. That's no longer fear, it's intent. On the evening of December 19th, the jury retired to deliberate. The courtroom air was leaden. O'Donnell stepped into the hallway, gazing at snow falling outside the window. She thought of William Doyle's image, the 1949 sheriff, she knew only through yellowed notes. If he were alive, he'd stand here seeing the justice he once pursued. 9 hours later, at 2 a.m., the jury returned. All rose as the judge asked, "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson replied, "We have, Your Honor." His voice rang clear in the hushed space. "We, the jury, find the defendant Matthew Carver guilty of second-degree murder." The room held silent for seconds more, then the judge's pen signed like the final hammer blow of the past. Carver sat still, eyes closed, no reaction. As officers approached to cuff him, he murmured, almost whispering, "I suppose she can finally rest now." O'Donnell stood behind, silent. In that moment, she knew the case ended not just for the victim, but for all who had traversed half a century to reclaim the truth. The next morning, state newspapers headlined, "Camden 1949, Nurse Disappearance. Doctor Convicted of Murder, After 54 Years," to the public. It was a triumph of modern forensics. To Jennifer O'Donnell, it was tribute to William Doyle, who wrote in his final report, "Truth doesn't vanish, it just waits to be seen." And today, in Knox Courthouse, that truth was finally seen, recorded, and judged in the true language of justice. The morning news on Bangor station WLBZ echoed through every home across Maine. The 1949 Camden disappearance case closes after over half a century. Dr. Matthew Carver, 89, convicted of second-degree murder, sentenced 54 years after the night. Nurse Alexine Penrose vanished. That opening line reverberated over radio waves, local TV screens, then spread through the small town by Penobscot Bay. Elders paused mid-snow shoveling. Children heard parents retell a story they once thought legend. All of Maine fell into stunned silence. Half felt relief. The haunting, unsolved mystery finally resolved. The other half raged, unable to believe the respected doctor who saved hundreds over decades was the killer. In Camden, local papers sold out in one morning. Front pages showed Carver handcuffed, leaving court, aged face, eyes closed, as if accepting time's judgment over man's. Below the photo, bold headline, "The Town Doctor, a Past Crime." Some brought flowers to his old clinic, windows still bearing the gold sign. Dr. M. Carver, Family Practice. Some wept, some cursed. An elderly neighbor said, "He cured my husband in 1958. It can't be him." Others, older, whispered, "I always knew something was off that night." Doyle was right, but no one believed. The community split sharply. On quiet Bay streets, debates erupted everywhere in coffee shops, grocery stores, school hallways. One side thanked police for not abandoning the case. The other said dredging the past stripped the town of an old icon. But beneath the arguments, one thing stood clearer. People began remembering Alexine Penrose, not as a missing person, but as a human being. 3 weeks after the verdict, Camden held an official memorial at the central square. Winter cold bit deep, white fog cloaking rooftops, but hundreds stood silent before her black and white photo. The nurse in white uniform, gentle smile, bright eyes. Inspector Jennifer O'Donnell was there, beside the monument to medical servants. She looked around, seeing familiar faces, grandchildren of William Doyle, who first opened the case file in 1949, standing front row. The MC read from Doyle's notes, "Justice may be slow, but it never dies." All bowed heads, and a strong bay wind swept through, carrying white ribbons from the wreath bearing Alexine's name. As the ceremony ended, townsfolk filed toward Megantuck Harbor. There, the old lumber dock, once the final scene, now bore a small memorial plaque. The inscription read simply, "In memory of Nurse Alexine Penrose, who served this community with compassion, and to remind us that truth always finds its way." People silently laid flowers, fog blending with bay mist, making the scene hazy like an old photo freshly developed. In the cold case unit archives in Augusta, O'Donnell alone closed the evidence box lid. Inside, everything arranged one last time, the MC engraved brass button, the brown AP leather medicine bag, fingerprint photos, and a small gray fabric scrap stuck to a vial cap. On the lid, she affixed a new label, "Solved. Case hash 4912A Penrose, Alexine 1949, 2003. As the box slid back into the metal cabinet, the lock clicked softly, sealing a journey over half a century for a case thought buried forever. On the drive back to Camden, O'Donnell stopped at the docks. Thick fog blanketed the water, cold wind carrying rhythmic waves against the wooden bridge. Pilings. She stepped out, standing exactly where Alexine's body had been exhumed. Everything silent, only distant buoy bells echoing offshore. She closed her eyes, imagining the 1949 night, jeep lights dim in fog, engine fading, then silence. Only this time, she knew that silence had an answer. Turning away, O'Donnell spotted a white ribbon scrap on the bridge railing, perhaps carried from the ceremony by wind. She picked it up, folding it neatly into her pocket, as a reminder that justice sometimes arrives late, but it arrives. Over the foggy backdrop, waves blending with the TV reporter's voice closing the final broadcast, a button, a lie, and justice at last. The image faded, Megantuck Harbor shrouded in white mist, first seasonal snowflakes drifting onto the water. And in the cold case unit basement, evidence box hash 4912, lay silent under yellow light, like a heart stilled after fulfilling its mission. 54 years, one town, one lie, all now ended, leaving only wind and water where Alexine Penrose's memory would forever remain with Camden. In today's United States context, the story of Alexine Penrose reminds us of three very practical things. Truth takes time, systems need discipline, and people need courage. A half-century forgotten MC engraved button, a red waxed medicine bag with Dr. Carver's fingerprints, and finally YSTER DNA shattering denials. That's not magic, but the result of archiving standardized procedures and cold case unit persistence. Lessons for life, one at work and home, document and preserve, emails, messages, photos, shift logs. Those fragments can become oars, bringing truth to shore, like the Camden Reconstruction Mat Health Center Rockport Harbor did. 2. Don't let professional halo blind vigilance. Carver was a revered Bangor doctor for decades, yet he prescribed off-record meds in staged scenes. In practice, if suspecting professional abuse, drugs, finances, power, borrow two-person integrity principle, report to independent manager or state hotline. 3. When witnessing intimate conflicts, don't downplay. In the U.S., lines like 988, mental crisis or National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799, SAFE exist for early intervention, because just a slip can become 54 years of lies. Finally, communities, don't let nostalgia trump duty, hold memorials like Camden did, but also support budgets for forensics, record digitization, and investigator training. Late justice is still justice, as long as today we sow habits protecting truth. If you believe truth, no matter how long buried, deserves to be found, hit subscribe to join us in unraveling forgotten cases. Thank you for watching to the end. See you in the next story, where justice may arrive late, but never vanishes.